I began the previous episode by setting aside pitch considerations for the time being so that we could focus on duration, timing, and rhythm. However, for this episode, we need to bring our interest in pitch back to the table for a variety of reasons, as we'll discover very shortly. The first thing that I can point out is that with the kinds of relative values of duration that we learn how to notate using quarter notes, half notes, eighth notes, that sort of thing, there are already ways in which location on a staff, so something connected with pitch, affects how those note values are shown. So as you can see behind me on the board, I have the stem of the note going up and to the right of the note head up until the middle point of the staff line, at which point I can make a choice to drop it down, but there above I must have that stem down and to the left. It's kind of like there's, a bird hanging onto a wire with its talons, and somehow it has fallen underneath, and the talons are still in the same place with respect to the legs of the bird. So this is, in a sense, preserving the original orientation of the stem and the note head even when it's turned upside down. However, one thing that would remain unchanged is if you happen to have flags attached to these things. And I like thinking of these literally as flags in this case, because it's rather like music is a wind blowing in this direction. Certainly we're reading from left to right, and the flags always point us in the direction that that musical wind is taking us. Now there are a few things that are helpful about this kind of arrangement. For example, if I see a melody that does something like this, let's imagine something else has been going on beforehand. And by the way, none of this depends upon a particular clef. It's simply the staff itself. When we come to that middle line, we have a choice to make. And if I see, for example, that that choice has been made, and let's say I have to turn the page or I have to jump down to the start of another line, I'm going to be a little bit anxious about what note I might have to be prepared to sing or to play. Well, one thing this tells me is that what's likely to happen is the next pitch will fall somewhere down here, because that choice has been made to keep the stem orientation up. So I might see something like this. However, if I suddenly came across that, knowing that a choice has been made, and let's imagine once again that I have to turn the page or my eye has to skip to another line on it, I look at that and right away that would tell me the choice has been made because what follows is likely to be above there. So in a very subtle and efficient way, you can give musicians performing your music a sense of how to prepare themselves for the notes that are coming ahead. So that's just another one of those little devices that we can use to aid someone when they have to read music, especially at sight, which, by the way, most professional musicians spend most of their time doing. Not many professional musicians have the opportunity to sit around and practice things for hours on end. A lot of music is thrown in front of them and they have to produce it immediately. So we always want to have that idea in mind that graphic notation works as well as it conveys the sense of how the music is behaving or will behave. You always want to be kind of telegraphing as much information to performers as you possibly can. Now there are other things that you can do as well. This is just assuming, for example, that I would have one melodic line on musical stem. However, it is possible to have, of course, more than one line. These things can be connected with each other, like so, or like so. That's normal enough, but you can also write intervals like that as being produced by separate voices or instruments on a single staff. So for example, later on in this course, specifically in episode 12, we'll be learning about something called vocal scoring, where you would have two parts being written on a staff. You might be working with a treble clef, might be working with a bass clef, and the idea behind that is that we might have harmonies being built up, but through individual participants, and we're trying to show those harmonies being made in such a way that I can read and observe each line independently. It will be very helpful later on, therefore, to get a sense of how a combination of melodies can be used to build up a harmonic texture. So that's going to be the subject matter of episode 12. So this is one thing we typically do in those circumstances. Yes, these intervals could be written with just one stem in each case, but the idea here is to kind of partition things so that we can read the musical information in more melodic terms. So there are lots of ways in which we can adapt this notation to serve particular interests. But what I'm especially interested in today is the role of pitch in something else, which is a huge topic. And to introduce that, what I'm going to do for you is play a couple of examples. They actually come from the course website, and I could, of course, play them on the piano, but I want to use the course website for a very particular reason, and that is the instrumentation that I use, of course, is generated by essentially a digital synthesizer, and as a result, no inflection can be given to any of the notes that are being played. Unlike the way I might perform something at a piano where I might decide that I want to emphasize some note more than another, that kind of thing, the examples that we will hear will provide no such differentiation whatsoever. So in some senses, those performances might sound a bit monotone. There's another reason why they might sound a bit monotone, and that is because both of those musical excerpts will be working with the identical beat structure at the identical tempo. So what we will hear are two pieces of music that use a beat that is coming at precisely the same rate. And what we'll be interested in hearing is whether those pieces therefore sound fundamentally similar or fundamentally different in some way. So because the instrumentation that I'm using, QuickTime instruments, have a way of just kind of flattening out all other features of the music. The volume will be the same throughout. Nothing will be played slightly faster or slightly slower. Everything is going to be even Steven. It's going to create a kind of oral experiment for us to hear how beat structures by themselves don't always give us the full amount of information we would like to understand how music operates. There's something in music that can operate above the beat. So here's the first example. And here is the second example. So you might recognize both of those tunes. One of them is from a movie from many, many years ago, and the other is from A Galaxy Far, Far Away. The idea behind this little comparison is to listen for the use of beat structure in particular. And what I'd suggest is, in each case, we have something taking place where we can imagine like clapping our hands or snapping our fingers in a regular way. So it could be something like tap, 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 or tap, 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 tap. So that idea of tapping to what seem to be obvious beat components is something that should transfer precisely from one of these examples to the other. So I'll play the two for you again and see if you can tap along to it, clap along to it, whatever you like. So once again, the first example. So try to keep that pace in your mind while you hear the second example. So you can play those examples for yourself as often as you like, but you'll see that they are moving at precisely the same tempo. And if I imagine that tempo to be defined by a quarter note pulse, then we would have precisely the same number of quarter notes per minute taking place. And yet, they sound profoundly different. Now, what I'm aware of when I listen to these examples is that they seem, in a sense, to move differently, even if there is this underlying regularity. The first example, to my ear, sounds a little bit like a march of some kind. The second one sounds a little bit like what I describe as a slow waltz. And in fact, between the two of them, the first piece somehow sounds as though it's going faster than the second one, even though with respect to metronomic tempo, they are going at precisely the same rate. So it's kind of like some sort of magic trick is being pulled here. Now, what we're actually noticing is a sense of difference in grouping, that one of these pieces seems to group things in units of 2, and the other in terms of groups of 3. So obviously in the case of the march, we have something taking place that sounds like it comes clearly in units of 2. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, right? The waltz, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Now, this grouping phenomenon is usually described in terms of how much stress or emphasis is given to one beat rather than to another one. For example, one might say that in the first case, the more march-like one, every second beat gets some kind of stress of some kind. And in the case of the second example, that it's every third beat that gets that stress. So it's kind of like we have these units that are being defined by emphasis or stress. Now, here's the strange thing. It might be the case that when I play either of those pieces on the piano, I would be tempted to actually apply more stress to them. However, it might sound a bit unnecessary. And in fact, this is one reason why when young children get taught how to play the piano or something like that, when they're encouraged to actually create these groupings, these units, and really provide the stress that's supposed to define these things, the music often sounds a little bit kind of primitive in a way, a little bit heavy-handed. We're hearing this grouping, in fact, without any stress being applied whatsoever. The grouping is actually coming from the pitch structure of the music and not from any change in stress or emphasis that's being applied to the notes. How do I know that? Because I'm working with QuickTime instruments and they are doing absolutely nothing to distinguish the stress or amplitude of one pitch from the next. Everything that I hear is coming out of the pitch structure itself. So what I'm talking about is a subject called meter, which we can understand at a basic level as our sense of beats coming in groups. And meter is often taught as though it's all about how much emphasis or stress is given to one beat rather than another one. And certainly one can add that to any musical performance at one's peril sometimes. However, we should notice that this idea of metrical grouping is something that actually grows out of pitch structure itself under normal circumstances. And therefore, one of the things that we want to do is begin to recognize how these grouping phenomena can develop regardless of whether we are trying to apply more physical force to notes or not. Well-written music tends to create these structures in their own sense of a distribution of pitches. So for example, if I consider the march-like thing that I was listening to that seems to come in clearly defined groups of 2, well, whatever my melody is doing, I have an accompaniment underneath that's doing this kind of thing. And there I'm probably applying a bit of stress to every second pitch. So I'm alternating between a C and an A flat, a C and an A flat, and I'm probably hitting the C's a little bit harder than I actually need to. However, it's this alternation between C and A flat that right away sets up a framework in my ear, such as I heard in the website examples where no stress is being applied. And then once that framework has been put in place, it stays with my mind. So no matter what else will be going on in the music, in the melody, a kind of expectation has been set up that I will hear all of this pitch and rhythmic activity taking place inside of. There is a larger framework beyond just the beat itself. And I can imagine something marching along at a relatively brisk pace. When I listen to something like this waltz tune, and I'm playing it not in the same precise set of notes that you see on the website. I kind of like shifting things down a semitone. So obviously I have a melody that's doing its own kind of thing. And underneath that I have this accompaniment that's very regularly giving me beats. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And I'm grouping them as 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 because I hear this shift between something that's in a lower part of the register, followed by intervals that are in an upper part of the register. So here are two very basic ways in which we can start to have groupings of things, and we call these simple metrical units. So just to explain a little bit further, if I have this idea of meter, meaning the capacity to group beats in some way, what I am talking about is having music that occurs as a result of putting together metrical units, one after the other, after the other, after the other. So in terms of metrical units, I have some basic ones to work with that we call simple meter. So we have things that come in groups of 2, like we heard as the underpinning of that march, and we call those simple duple meters. And I have something else, which is a grouping in groups of 3. You can refer to that as a triple meter. And what that means is that, okay, if I can't say that some beats necessarily have more stress or more emphasis than others, because in terms of our conventional language, that suggests that more force is being applied, that they'll be louder or something like that. And of course, we don't need that at all. So what I can say is that some beats have more prominence. And that prominence can be a result of someone applying more force to play them or sing them. That prominence could be the result of the kinds of things that we heard in these two examples, an alternating pattern of some kind that at least suggests a grouping in and of itself, or as in the case of the waltz where we have one pitch that's lower than the other two, the beat that's associated with that is kind of isolated and set aside in that sense. And once again, my ear will highlight that in some fashion. And I don't necessarily have to apply force to it in any way, shape, or form. So what that means is that if I have these groupings, there's a beginning to the group and then what comes afterward. The beginning of the group is what we refer to as the downbeat. So that's going to be the thing that starts out the metrical unit. And what I'm going to want to do now is start to look at how this basic idea is something that we can represent in musical notation, because so far all we've been thinking about is notating durational values and then thinking about how to frame them within the structure of the beat. Well, now we have a larger scale structure to concern ourselves with, and that is what happens when beats form groups. Once again, I would like the notation to reflect what the music feels like, because if I'm playing that march or that waltz, they feel very differently to me, even if they're going at the identical tempo, and even if they were using the identical value to mark the pulse of the beat, say a quarter note pulse. Regardless, they sound different, they feel different. I want that to be in the musical picture through which they are presented to me. So there are some particular devices that we can use to indicate that. And the foremost amongst these things is what we call the time or meter signature. Now, if I have something like a duple meter, what that means is conventionally I would have a clef. I could have some other kinds of information following that clef, which I'll be talking about specifically in episode 9. But right now, if I'm thinking about something that comes in groups of 2, I have a number that would be indicating that grouping effect. Okay, so this would tell me that I will have something that I will experience as these groups of 2, but I need to know groups of 2 what? What will be the value of the beat that's being grouped in this way? And so, for example, if I were thinking of these particular types as notated with a quarter note pulse, I would show that by putting in this number in the denominator, if you will. So it's as though I'm imagining a way of writing something like that underneath. This is to refer to the quarter note. So it's kind of like a denominator idea, although not actually, of course. And I want 2 of those things. So that means that I would have this idea being conveyed here. Now, what's helpful about this is, of course, I'm literally showing that, but I could have all sorts of other rhythms being applied there in terms of what my melody is actually doing. So what I'm doing is writing the rhythm that I would use for the march if I were working with a quarter note pulse. So this is telling me that I'm not supposed to just read this in terms of an underlying quarter note pulse or something like that, but that these things are coming in these groups of 2, and I should feel that. That's also going to be reflected, of course, in the accompaniment that's being provided. However, there's a way in which I would like that information to be visually echoed throughout the score, and so what I start to add in to reflect that time or meter signature, and by the way, I use those terms interchangeably because the idea of a time signature is rather vague. Usually at universities now we refer to meter signatures because this is something describing meter itself rather than just some vague notion of time. However, outside of academic departments, people still talk about time signatures all the time. So I'm happy to use either of those terms, and I'll go back and forth between them. But what I'm doing is showing the metrical units that are enclosed in this fashion by things called Barlines, and what we get visually is something that's called a measure. So a measure is a way to show what the underlying metrical units are that you were signaled through the time signature. Okay? So you have some sense of this 2/4 idea visually as you continue to read on. Okay? And for that reason, because this, for the time being, we'll assume will stay in place, after the first system of music, after your first set of states, you don't need to keep rewriting your time or meter signature because that information is being echoed throughout the score by these measures enclosed by bar lines. Now, important thing to keep in mind is that these are relative values of duration. I could also, of course, change things around so that I have an 8th note pulse that's marked by the beat. In that case, this is still a duple meter. The structure of the meter itself comes from that upper number, that numerator, if you will. I would have, of course, to renotate all of this in conjunction with that, but I would still have the same sense of grouping, dum, bum, 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 ba, bum, bum, ba, bum. Okay? Now, we had another option, which was thinking of the waltz, where our grouping was in units of 3. So whatever the beat pulse happens to be, if it's a metrical unit of 3, triple meter of some kind, that number 3 is going to be in the numerator. Let's say we were going with a quarter note pulse again, as per the original example. I would expect to see this sort of enclosure for the note values, the actual rhythms that I'm working with. But, of course, the melody, or notating that, the rhythm for that is that. So whatever these particular note values are, whatever the particular rhythms happen to be, the enclosure following the time signature tells me that I'm filling groups of 3 underneath, and we start to notice how we don't have to be quite so fussy about notating precisely in terms of an underlying beat structure. The enclosure that's provided by the Barlines, these measures that I see there, they create kind of a small snapshot that already is being interpreted in these terms. So if I'm filling things in groups of 3, I don't need to get all fussy and go, right, I should notate that in this fashion, so that I can see each and every single beat. I don't need that because I know that I'm working within the context of this larger unit, this triple meter unit, so I'm expecting things to fill up groups of 3. There's absolutely no need for me to subdivide that because I look at the measure and I know I'm supposed to feel 3 things here. That is perfectly easy to read, and this is no less easy to read. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, very easily done. So the introduction of these measures that enclose these metrical units radically simplifies the notation that we work with. It's still a very useful skill to be able to notate particular rhythms according to an underlying beat structure. It's not a skill that we want to lose, but we've been freed up a lot in this fashion. Let's briefly consider some of the consequences that come for rhythmic notation from the introduction of the measure. In general, measures greatly simplify the kinds of techniques we use for rhythmic notation because we're seeing things in smaller units. So for example, as we already know, it is very easy for me to see that this note value is filling up the full value of the measure. I don't actually need to subdivide that into 2 quarter notes with a tie between them to reflect the value of the beat. This is easily read. And even if I happen to introduce rhythms that are a little bit more complex, one thing that my eye can grasp hold of is the fact that there's in some sense an implied middle of the measure here, and I can see that this note value slightly extends beyond it, and I will read what follows in light of that. Likewise, here this longer note value comes just ahead of the middle of the measure. So if I were to play this and try to capture that sense of the underlying beat structure and where these note values are coming in relation to the middle of the measure, we might be able to see that clearly. And also, we have to be cautious of the fact that we don't want anything extending beyond the value of the measure. So though I was using dotted quarter notes in these cases, I can't use a dotted half note here because that would extend that value beyond the measure. And if I do that, then I'm losing the neat framework that is supplied for me by the measure. I want to retain those nice enclosures for rhythmic activity. So here I must use a tie. Here's another example of how being able to see the middle of the measure makes it easy for me to read a rhythm. Yes, I could renotate that as a pair of eighth notes, each one beamed separately with a tie connecting the middle two, but this will be easily read because, once again, as the rhythm proceeds, I can clearly see how this note value stands across the middle of the measure, and I'll have no difficulty reading that rhythm. Now, speaking of beaming, it's often the case that in instrumental music we will see notes that can be beamed simply being beamed in a simple meter. So you'll frequently see circumstances like this. Once again, it's easy for me to see the middle of the measure, so I really don't need to subdivide into separate beats. This is frequently the case for 3/8 rhythms as well, or 3/16, when we're dealing with notation for instruments. And finally, we have a new use for the whole rest. It can actually mean the whole measure. And once again, the idea is that when you see this, you automatically know that whatever value would be employed for that full measure, we're simply getting silence. So yes, I could be more precise and put in a half note value, but this indication is clear enough that the entire measure needs to be kept silent. And finally, at the very end, of course, I don't have to have note values all the time. This measure is cognate with that one, and so I can introduce an eighth note rest to take the place of that literal eighth note in the previous measure, and I would read it in the same way. So I'll play the whole excerpt for us, and in that way we can see how this greater flexibility in notation still makes the rhythm easily read. So the next thing I want to do is see what the impact is of the measure on pitch notation. The introduction of the measure also has consequences for the notation of pitch, specifically accidental use. What we'll discover now is that accidentals work within the context of the measure. Once you've crossed the bar line and into the terrain of the subsequent measure, the accidental from the previous one is turned off. So in this case, I have an F sharp. Once I cross that bar line, the note head that's appearing on that line is not affected by that accidental anymore. This is an F natural. If I wanted to have this same melodic contour within a single measure, this is where I would need to introduce the use of the natural to be able to turn off the activity of that sharp within the measure. Likewise, I need to do the same thing if I wanted to undo the introduction of a flat, as in this case. Now, one thing that might seem to be an unhelpful consequence of the measure is that it's constantly wiping out all accidental use. We'll discover in episode 9 that it is possible to make a distinction between accidentals that are used regularly and accidentals that are used only occasionally. It's something called a key signature. It will be coming in at the beginning of the staff right between the clef and the time or meter signature, as we'll see. And then what's wonderful about the measure is that it will be constantly wiping the board clean of all accidentals that we don't want to make regular use of. So there will be a kind of framing collection of accidentals that will persist throughout the score, and all of these other occasional ones will helpfully disappear once we've used them. One other thing that I can do, if I want, is to create an accompaniment. And here's where we start to discover ways in which the notation of meter can make a more complex score easier to read. I would, for example, repeat that time or meter signature in the other parts that go with this. If I was playing this on a piano, I'm indicating the rhythms for the accompaniment. And what I'm trying to do here is line things up as clearly as possible between the two staves so that I see how they will coordinate with each other. By the way, I'm applying a double bar line at the end because that's something I can do to indicate the end of something. Obviously, this is not the end of the piece, but I'm just showing another thing that we can use to articulate larger scale structures. And I've tried to line these things up as best I can. However, in fact, if these are being played by the same instrument, we actually connect everything in this fashion at the start, and likewise extend the bar lines in between the staves. We'll include the double bar lines here at the end, so that when I read something like this, I can see that these are being not only coordinated with each other, but on the same instrument. If I look at the score for symphony, let's imagine that was playing this waltz, I would expect to see this kind of thing for the harp, if the harp was being used, because that's written using treble and bass clef. Other parts in a symphonic score, however, would use the fact that there is no connecting set of bar lines to differentiate between the different parts. So if I had, I don't know, violins playing this and cellos playing that, I can see visually that they're coordinated, but the fact that these are not directly connected with each other tells me that, yes, as I read the score, this is for one instrument, this is for another. And by the way, you still use the initial lines to indicate what would be connecting all of the instruments together. So if there were a further instrument down here playing in some other clef, who knows what, I would indicate all of these playing together at this end, and then the separation between them here, okay? Just one last note, and that is, if I happen to use something like that, which we typically use for the piano, that's also known as the grand staff, in the sense that, yes, I have two separate staves, but I'm understanding the sort of continuity of showing where pitches can be from bass up through treble. Okay, so that's some of the most basic information that we need for working with the notation of meter. This idea of the downbeat, that's something that we can always quickly and readily identify. It's what immediately comes either at the very beginning or right after the bar line. And even if there were no actual sound there, let's imagine that for some reason there was going to be an eighth note delay, that is still the downbeat. That is still where we would expect it, because it might not be the case that I'm giving it in my melody, but it could be in some other part. And in fact, one of the characteristic features of something like ragtime is you have a form of syncopation where you kind of hang on to a note and don't, in your melody at least, give the downbeat an actual articulated pitch in the melodic line. You kind of hang on to something and it comes in afterwards. It's a very characteristic effect. Well, the effect works to the extent that there still is a downbeat, whether I'm literally playing a note on the downbeat or not, okay? So just before we leave this, remember that the downbeat doesn't mean the beat that you hit harder or play louder or anything like that. It's simply a beat that for a variety of reasons will have more prominence and therefore serves as the kind of starting point for a metrical unit of some type. And the basic types of metrical units we've looked at so far have been simple duple and simple triple. So what that means is that there's a differentiation between beats at one level. Either they have more prominence or they don't. And in each case, there's only one prominent beat. For duple, it's every second beat. For triple, it's every third. But isn't it possible to extend beyond this? Can't we create more complex and interesting metrical structures? What I'm going to give you right now is just an overview of the particular topic areas we're going to follow up on. If I decide that I want to come up with larger metrical units of some kind, and I don't want to restrict myself to just having two levels of beat, either prominent or not. Maybe there could be different levels of prominence. What I'm interested in doing in that case is what I call compounding. So what that means is that I take like types of simple meter and put them together in some fashion, okay? So this is going to be a really crucial idea because the concept of compound meter literally means what it sounds like, a compound effect, more than one metrical structure occurring at the same time. So I'm not just hearing one thing, I'm hearing two kinds of metrical structure simultaneously. That's a crucial idea. In a compound meter that is being created out of these simple metrical units, and I'll talk more specifically about that in the next segment. So we're just sort of looking ahead. This is composed of the same type of simple metrical units in a variety of ways. Okay? We have another type, asymmetric, which can also be understood as a combination of simple metrical units. So what might distinguish them? For the compounding effect, they are of the same type. For asymmetric meters, they are of a different type. And that's going to be the crucial distinction between them. So in a sense, both of these are creating larger metrical units out of smaller ones, but this is working with the same type of thing. So there'll be a certain uniformity there. This will be using different types of simple metrical units, so it's going to be a bit more disjointed. Now, sometimes asymmetric meters are referred to as irregular meters. That term does get used. I don't particularly like it because if it's an asymmetric meter, often it still has a regularity to it. So what matters is the asymmetry and not the fact that something might not be easily dividable into two or something like that. Okay? So what we'll be especially interested in is this notion of a combination of different parts to create a kind of effect that's very different from the compound meter. And then finally, we will consider the possibility for changing meter. Up to this point in time, what I have been assuming is that some metrical organization, once established, is being maintained for at least some major section of music. However, you can have a change at some point over a certain period of time, but if someone is changing meters on a regular basis in close succession or relatively close succession, we do refer to that as changing meter. So that's the kind of overview of the types of meter that we'll be looking at in the next few segments. And of course, after all of this, what we're going to want to do is learn how to actually make use of meter, in particular for writing songs. And the reason I want to do that is not just because I have an interest in teaching practical skills in a course like this, but also because I can't think of a better way to become comfortable in working with meter. What we do in terms of setting a text to music will be very concerned with the structure that's provided by downbeats, and then how that can be spread out further through these other types of meters. So text setting will be a way for us to review all of these things in a very practical context. I want to return to the topic of pulse streams that we took up in the previous episode, because pulse streams will help us to understand the next level of meter that we're interested in, specifically the notion of compound meter. There's a way in which I could define meter as the subdivision of one pulse by another. Let me show you what I mean. If I think back to the examples that I played earlier on in this episode, I was introducing them by saying they're working with the same underlying beat structure. It's a quarter note pulse. It's going at precisely the same rate. So in a sense, both of those pieces look like this from the standpoint of the pulse that's marked by the beat. Quarter note, quarter note, quarter note, quarter note. Now, of course, when we were listening to them, we heard in the case of the march a grouping of these beat pulses into units of 2, and in the case of the waltz into units of 3. So there's a way in which I could say that this particular beat pulse is subdividing a larger pulse, which is governed by half notes in the case of the march. So dum bum ba dum ba da dum ba dum. This is subdividing that. What does this represent? the pulse that's marked by the downbeats. So these are all of the beats. Every second beat is a downbeat, and that's initiating the start of this unit of pulse. So meter, therefore, as a subdivision of one unit of pulse by another one, when that subdivision is into groups of two, it's a simple duple meter. If I considered the waltz, on the other hand, I was hearing the downbeat every third beat. Therefore, if this is a subdivision of one pulse by another, the pulse that's being subdivided is this one. Da, da, dee, and so on. So beat pulse is determined by the beats themselves, and what I call the metrical pulse is established by going from downbeat to downbeat. So these are two different ways of subdividing things. I could take this a couple steps further, but let's keep in mind the idea that this can be translated to different values of duration. So, for example, we considered the possibility that the beat pulse could be eighth notes, in which case this would be a subdivision of something like this. Metrical pulse from downbeat to downbeat, the beat pulse that's subdividing it, and there's that grouping effect. Now, if I happen to want to create larger structural units in some sense, I notice that I could, in fact, start to play around with aspects of the music that might involve the management of stress, amplitude, emphasis, that kind of thing. If I think of that waltz, for example, I have a melodic line that does seem to suggest units of two measures of simple meter. 1, 2, 1, 2. And even if I have this going on underneath, I could play this so that I have a sense of larger grouping. So what I'm trying to do is create larger metrical units. However, I cannot escape the impression that the pitch structure itself makes on my ears. I'm hearing these larger units, but I'm still hearing the smaller units that make them up. So in that sense, I'm kind of hearing two meters at once. I'm hearing something that is in groups of three, which is unmistakable given the accompaniment. But it's also possible for me to hear groups of six, depending on how I play my melody and try to shape things a little bit through what we call musical dynamics, how loud or soft I'm playing the notes that I'm working with. So what that means is that I could have, in this sense, a subdivision of a pulse that's also subdivided by a pulse. I can have more than one level of metrical activity, more than one level of metrical subdivision. I'll show you what I mean. Let's imagine that that waltz that I was playing was in fact written in a 6/8. What that would mean is that, again, I cannot help but hear these groupings of three, because that is literally written into the accompaniment. But it could be the case that the composer might ask me to hear a larger unit such that I'm also feeling a grouping of two, which is a subdivision of something else, like that. What that means is two things. First of all, that I have a new level of placement for the downbeat. The downbeat isn't coming here and here. It's coming here, and it won't return again until over here with the start of new grouping. I'll just write etc. there. So where before I would have had for simple triple measures drawn here, now it's like I'm removing a measure and the beat that's right at the start of the measure is there, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and there again. So I'm getting a compound metrical effect, a subdivision of one pulse by another, and yet again a subdivision of one pulse by another. 2 levels of metrical activity. That means that the new metrical pulse in this case is down here. That is to say, the metrical pulse moving from downbeat to downbeat is now taking place over a larger grouping of notes. And what had been the metrical pulse before from downbeat to downbeat is now a subdivision of that. So this becomes, I'll write it with a different color pen, a submetrical pulse. What that means is that where before I used to have all of these as downbeats, now the downbeats are only arising there and there. So there's still a level of metrical prominence that's being given to these beats. That's unavoidable because of the nature of the accompaniment. I can't stop hearing the 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 underneath. But a larger grouping is being now set up. And that idea of a larger grouping is something that we refer to as compound meter. Now, there's something really important to observe here, and that is that the compound literally means that there isn't just one subdivision of a pulse by another. It's happening at more than one level. That is why it is compound. That is why I am hearing more than one metrical grouping at a time. I'm hearing the subdivision into groups of 3, and at the same time here, I'm hearing a subdivision into groups of 2. So I've got a triple subdivision here, a duple subdivision there. Put those things together, I'm getting a compound meter. Now, the term compound meter is often used to describe a situation that doesn't capture what makes it compound. I'll explain what I mean. Sometimes you will hear people say that a compound meter means the beat is subdivided into groups of 3. That actually makes no sense whatsoever, because if I were looking at something like this, the idea that I'm trying to represent is something that would correspond with a time or meter signature of that. This is the value of pulse that's marked by the beat. There's nothing being subdivided into 3 at that level. What is being subdivided into 3 is this submetrical pulse. I am hearing these groupings of 3 as a subdivision of these, in this case, dotted quarter notes, and at the same time I'm hearing that as a subdivision of something else. So what is being described as a subdivision in groups of 3 is this layer of the compound meter, and that's leaving out entirely this layer. And likewise, it's ignoring the fact that the actual beat value is still an 8th note pulse. So what we have to recognize is that a compound meter is literally more than one metrical activity happening at the same time, and also in that sense that it's not restricted just to groupings of 3. I'll show you that in just a moment. The first thing that I want to notice is that this is one of those circumstances where we can make further changes to our notation of the values of duration. We can actually start to apply beams to show submetrical groupings. So for example, in a compound meter, if I have my measure lines drawn in that fashion, what I try to do to help a musician recognize what's going on and how to feel these particular rhythms is I will beam according to these submetrical units. By that I mean these grouping in terms of an underlying dotted quarter note value. So literally now when I look at this notation, I can see the submetrical units and also the subdivision of the larger metrical unit into these two parts. So the two parts are showing this subdivision there, and these are, of course, are being reflected by the beams there. And that's going to be true whether I'm literally using eighth notes or if I'm throwing in some other kinds of rhythms. That would also be showing how, through the use of beaming, we have these submetrical units. It's not supposed to be a dot. Or I beam together what I can within that submetrical unit. So this is a way in which we can use beaming where it's available to kind of reassure our musicians that yes, you are supposed to be feeling it in this type of grouping. And by the way, we'll be able to do this in a different fashion with asymmetric meters, as we will see. Okay, but the next issue I want to address then is, can we only have compound metrical effects working with subdivisions into groups of three? Certainly not, because we have things called marches, for example, and marches typically have a time or meter signature of 4/4. And by the way, sometimes that type of meter signature will be shown as C, or common time as we call it. It's actually a derivation from older medieval mensural notation, but I won't go into those details. So you'll sometimes see that. Anyhow, the idea of a 4/4 is probably what's being applied to something like this march that we've already heard. Now, that march has a kind of funny characteristic to it. It's moving harmonically in an interesting way that I'll talk about in the 12th and final episode, but it's changing harmonies underneath like this. And there's a way in which I could come up with another version of that. Now, if I were to play that piece in its original setting, it sounds like this. You might recognize that as Chopin Funeral March. It's from his Piano Sonata No. 2 in B-flat minor, and I can't help thinking that the composer, John Williams, of the other march, if he wasn't somehow inspired by Chopin's Funeral March and made it a little bit more up-tempo. Now, the reason why I mention the Chopin Funeral March is because that's one for which I actually have seen the music. This John Williams March, I'm just playing by ear. I'm assuming that it also uses this because that's the time signature that Chopin used for his Funeral March. Now, here's the thing. It is impossible to hear that funeral march as just 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, for all the reasons that I've already talked about. Just like the John Williams March, Chopin is working with an altering accompaniment in the bass. I can't not hear those groupings in units of 2 that are supplied by the accompaniment to the melody. That's unavoidable, that's inescapable, it's actually baked into the cake, as they say. It's part of the underlying pitch structure. Therefore, when I hear the Chopin Funeral March played the way it should be, which by the way is a very difficult thing to do, where there are these larger groupings of 4, I'm hearing 2 levels of metrical activity at the same time. I'm hearing both these submetrical units, if you will, of simple duple meter, now in the context of a larger overarching framework of 4/4. And I think the 4/4 fits the melodic idea because we have this repetition of an idea over what would be two measures of simple 2/4. So I had two units of two measures. That's another two measure unit if I'm thinking in 2/4. It makes sense melodically to organize that in terms of these larger units. So rather than two of two measures each, to turn them into groups of 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, and back to 1 again. So what that means, if I were to sketch it out, is the following. I would have a beat pulse, just like I had with the 6/8. I'm still getting that same information from the time signature. It's accurate, it's correct, of this. Therefore, I hear that, if I heard it as a simple meter, that would be a subdivision of a metrical pulse of half notes. So meter as a subdivision of one pulse by another. However, Chopin is asking for it to be played in a way that's more supportive of the structure of the melody. So these are still to be heard as a subdivision in turn of another level of pulse. So that I have the same ultimate arrangement. A beat pulse that is a subdivision of a submetrical pulse, what used to be simple duple, that is in turn a subdivision of something else. So I'm not claiming that 4/4 is always a compound meter, but more often than not it is. It's actually something that's built up once again of like submetrical units. So that's something that's true of all of these examples of compound meter. It's creating a larger metrical unit out of two smaller metrical units that become submetrical units that are of the same type. So combinations of simple duple or combinations of simple triple that then become part of a larger structure. Now, there is a way in which we can go back and forth between these things. And for example, there are famous pieces of music like West Side Story. I think the song is simply called America, where you can switch back and forth between these kinds of groupings. If you hear that song, and I definitely won't be playing that because I'm sure I would get the copyright police all over me for that. What you hear is a kind of moving back and forth in a very striking way between something that could add up to either a 6/8 or a 3/4. So imagine all of these are eighth notes. If I were to organize them in these terms, of course, what I would do is notate them like that. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. End of the measure. However, with the same amount of eighth notes, I could reorganize them in this fashion. Notated in that way, it reverts to a simple meter. I don't literally have to play those eighth notes. I could just play quarters, and then I could go back and forth between the 6/8 and the 3/4 with the same timing. might remember the tune now, and if not, just look up America West Side Story, and you can hear the whole thing. So there is a way in which we can actually go back and forth between different types of metrical arrangement. When we do something specific like this, where the overall context would be understood, for example, as a compound meter like a 6/8, and momentarily we kind of reorganize the groupings within to create a simple triple like this, we call that circumstance a hemiola. So there are ways in which you can reorganize the groupings within a compound meter to come up with these interesting metrical effects. But that would be switching from groups of 3 into essentially groups of 2. So I'm moving from one subdivision of metrical units of pulse to another one. It's kind of like hopping between different train tracks. The next thing that we're going to want to consider is it possible to actually bring these different kinds of submetrical units together? Can I go back and forth, for example, between subgroups of 2 and 3, or vice versa? So that's going to be the next topic, and that is asymmetric meter. So for compound meters, we were creating larger metrical units by taking smaller units of simple duple or simple triple, putting them together, and creating a larger structure that would be subdivided in different levels. That's what made it compound. But the crucial thing was that the component parts were of the same type. What happens if we actually mix and match, if you will, different types of submetrical units, groups of 3 and 2 at the same time, and not switching back and forth between them like we did in the hemiola, but making them part of the same metrical unit? Let's imagine, for example, that I wanted to come up with a grouping of 3, another grouping of 3, group of 2, kind of like that idea. I want to repeat that again. Grouping of 3, followed by another group of 3 and a group of 2. I want to do that again. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. Put it all together and I'm not making that up myself. I'm stealing that from the great Armenian composer Aram Khachaturian, and that's from a piece that he wrote for the piano called the Toccata. And what Khachaturian is showing us is how you can come up with a sense of regularity of some type that nonetheless is asymmetric. Why? Because the submetrical units are of different types. So this is why we refer to this as an asymmetric meter. And what's significant about that is that it's the makeup of the submetrical units. So for example, if I look at something like a 6/8 or a 4/4, I don't have a sense of asymmetry there, because 6 I can divide into 2 groups of 3, 4 I can subdivide into 2 groups of 2. There's something regular there. However, if I had a time signature like 5/4, I'd be tempted to say, well, I guess that's asymmetric because 5 is something that you could only subdivide into a group of 2 plus a group of 3. And that's going to be a possibility that we consider when we come to text setting. But in Khachaturian's case, time signature I'd be tempted to give to that would be something like 8/8. And 8 is something that does not evidently subdivide irregularly. I would just assume that I could subdivide it into 2 groups of 4. But what Khachaturian is doing is subdividing it into 3 plus 3 plus 2. So what that passage sounds like this: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And probably he has a time signature something like 4/4 or something like that, because 4/4 would be equivalent to 8/8. But the notation would reflect that we would have these groupings in units of 3 plus 3 plus 2. And again, that is something that you would hear regardless of how it were played at the piano. Now, obviously, physically, I'm playing that in a way where it's kind of fun to accentuate some beats rather than other ones. I want to kind of lean into the... But I could also score that for QuickTime instruments, play it so that it's given with absolutely uniform dynamics throughout, and we would still hear that same grouping taking place. Why? Because of the pitch structure of the music itself. I have a thing called a chord that's alternating with these repeated notes underneath. So I'm hearing the chord as the kind of initiation for each of these submetrical units. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And I wouldn't have to accentuate that in any way for us to hear that if I were to play that through quick time instruments. So keep that in mind. The idea of asymmetric meter doesn't come from any special number that's given in a numerator. As I already mentioned, that could in fact be notated as 4/4 for all I know. I'm not really sure because I'm just playing it by ear. But this is something that does not give away the secret of asymmetric meter. The secret of asymmetric meter is the submetrical units that it's composed out of. Unlike a compound meter, they are of different types. Now, the last thing that we'll want to consider in terms of our basic types of metrical organization is I've gone from simple meters through to compound meters and up to asymmetric meters, but in every case I've been assuming some kind of consistency for the most part throughout, except for the hemiola effect. What about changing meter? Is it possible for me to switch from one meter to another in relatively close succession? I'd like us to look at and listen to a particularly famous example of the use of changing meter, Modest Mussorgsky's Pictures at an Exhibition, which was composed in the 19th century. Pictures at an Exhibition is a kind of musical journal that records the composer's experience in going to an exhibit by the Russian painter Victor Hartmann. The collection of pieces is divided into two general types. On the one hand, we have pieces that offer musical portraits of the Hartmann paintings themselves, and on the other hand, pieces that try to recreate Mussorgsky's experience of moving between those artworks as he viewed them while walking along the museum floor. Now, Mussorgsky was not on a guided tour. He went to the exhibit to be intrigued and inspired by the paintings he saw, taking as much time as he wanted to contemplate each of them. And he was likewise moving between them without a sense of constraint, wandering around on his own rather than dutifully marching along with a group. He evidently felt that that kind of free-spirited museum visit could not be conveyed in musical terms by a conventional use of meter. So, Mussorgsky wrote a series of interlinking pieces called promenades that made use of changing meter, such as we see here. There is a continuity in the beat structure which perhaps corresponds with a steady footstep, in this case marked by a quarter note beat. But the more whimsical character of the visit is captured by the use of consistently changing metrical organization of the beat. We see alternating numerators in the time signature of 5 or 6 beats, and later on in the piece there's even the use of a 7/4 time signature. So let's listen to this brief segment of one of the promenades. So, although we can clearly hear the continuity of the beat structure, which is perhaps a little overemphasized by the use of a digital synthesizer, I suspect that we'd be hard-pressed to guess what the actual time or meter signatures were based on our listening experience alone. I also suspect that this is what the composer had in mind. Mussorgsky is using meter in such a way that we are left somewhat disoriented, like a museum goer who isn't quite sure which paintings he will turn to contemplate next. One of the fundamental skills of a musician is the capacity to set words to music, and we're at a point in the course where we're ideally prepared to begin to do that. It also happens to be the case that creating song lyrics, that is really establishing them in a musical framework of some type, is something that helps us to understand meter, I think, than just about anything. It's a very practical kind of exercise to be undertaking, one that reinforces precisely how meter works in concert with rhythm. Now, if we consider the way people normally speak, there's already a kind of inherent musicality there that is often enhanced through poetry. And by that I mean we have a way of emphasizing particular syllables, varying the duration of those syllables in a way that could, if we pay very careful attention to it, automatically turn into a framework for writing a song of some kind. And I'll give you a basic example of that. I can make a very basic statement, such as the one I've got written on the board. I had a dog who was very nice. Her love of caffeine was her only vice. That's actually a true story about my own dog from my childhood. And if I start to look at this example, what I notice is that there are ways in which natural inflection starts to place emphasis on particular syllables, such as I had a dog who was very nice. Her love of caffeine was her only vice. And what I've discovered is that there seems to be a natural line structure or scansion that has 4 stressed syllables per line. This would be similar to something like happy birthday, for example. Happy birthday to you, happy birthday to you, happy birthday, dear whoever, happy birthday to you. We call that a tetrameter. You don't have to worry about that term, but it just means that there is a continuity of stressed syllables per line, 4 of them, and then if I wanted to make them the framework for a song of some sort, it would make sense if they occurred in a regular fashion. So if I looked at text like this, had, dog, very, nice, love, fiend, only, vice. There's something about that that makes it possible for me to start to imagine what I might do with all the other syllables in between. So typically when we write a song and we begin to create actual lyrics out of text, one of the things that we need to do, first of all, is look at the text we are working with and analyze the syllabic structure. How many syllables are there? Where do stresses lie? And one thing that we might figure out right away is that meter provides us with a kind of framework for giving due musical stress or prominence to particular syllables. So I look at something like this and I could say, well, if I actually wanted to create a song out of this and I wanted to have these stressed syllables occurring in a regular fashion, that is something that I could associate with a metrical pulse. That is something that I could associate with downbeats. So one thing that I could do is quickly begin to sketch out this idea without getting into all the nitty-gritty details of how long should each of these syllables be and all the rest of it. I want to step back for a moment and just have kind of an overview of the text that I'm going to be working with. So what I can do is actually sketch out bar lines so that I can see measures before my very eyes and start to imagine what I could do within those measures. So note that in terms of the text itself, I've already provided an analysis of it. I've divided it up into single syllables. What we will be doing is creating a syllabic text setting. So that means 1 note value per syllable. It's not the only option. When you have texts where there are several notes per syllable, we refer to that as a melisma. A text setting that uses melismas is what we call melismatic. Again, it's a term that you don't need to memorize for this course, but just to let you know that the concept is there. That's something, for example, that you'll be able to make use of, if you like, for your 3rd assignment. But what we want to do right now is just engage with a syllabic setting so that we have as clear a picture as possible of how we can work rhythms out in light of an overall metrical framework of some type. Therefore, for any text that I would give you, I would always provide subdivision of all words clearly into their constituent syllables, and I'd also show you precisely which syllables are emphasized ones so that you always know what you're working with. As a musician, of course, the first thing that you would be doing is looking at a text yourself and looking for those possibilities, but I won't assume that of you. I want to get us to that second stage where we want to actually start creating some kind of musical structure. So the first thing that I will do to make that possible is do a sketch where I am ensuring that stressed syllables are always going to be associated with prominent beats, okay? The downbeats. This isn't where the process will end. I can take it beyond that, but at this level, I know for a certainty that I'm going to have a musical structure for whatever I do here that will be correct. It's also important because there are ways in which, on a whim, of course, we can vary how much we want to stress a syllable or how long we want to make it, but some words only make sense, only sound correct if you have stress on the correct syllable. So for example, we never say caffeine, it must be caffeine, and we never say only, it's only. So there's a way in which, if we are creating a song, for the most part, we want the text to actually sound like natural language, even if we are enhancing its inherent musical potential. So what I now have is a basic framework of measures, or potential measures, that could be used to go in multiple directions. The next thing I want to point out is that each line of what will be this song begins with an unstressed syllable. So in that sense, I appear to have incomplete measures there and there. Now there are a few things that we can do about that. First of all, let's imagine that for whatever reasons, I wanted to come up with a setting that was going to be a simple duple, because I see at least a couple of measures where I have two syllables. I could easily imagine putting two note values there, like I had a dog, etc., only over here. This is just one possibility that I'm noticing. If that were the case, of course, I'd be working with a 2-4 or something like that. I could do the following. I could start out something like this, that fashion, and have a complete measure, just starts with a rest. I could even make this quite short if I wanted to. And in that sense, if I have a very short note that's not stressed, I can call that a pickup of some kind. But I can also do something like this. I can have that incomplete measure there and make sure that it is completed down here. So if that's the case, I've used up everything in the measure except for 1/8. So if I use the appropriate value down here, that measure plus that measure, assuming that's the very end of the piece, it's a very short song, that ensures that these bookends together form one complete measure. But I have a problem, and that is I seem to have another incomplete measure in the middle, and we want to have metric continuity, because remember, what's going to make it seem musical is if I have this consistent sense of a metrical pulse running throughout where my stressed syllables are arriving on downbeats. So what I need to do actually is take this and move it into this previous measure. That's a very crucial step, and you might find that if you have text to set where there are multiple lines, that you have to do this several times, and maybe more than just one syllable. It could be a couple here, but again, if they are unstressed, they will belong in the tail end of the previous measure. One thing that you do not want to do at all, of course, is something like this to create a complete measure, because what that means is this unstressed syllable is arriving on a downbeat, and what that would do is completely throw off the underlying four-part syllable stress structure of the line. You're turning it from a tetrameter or tetrameter into a pentameter or pentameter, and that's going to then be out of sync with the next line. We don't want this. This has a nice structure to it. We don't say happy birthday like that, and then all of a sudden we have a sense of complete disjointedness between the lines. There's always happy birthday to you, happy birthday to you, happy birthday dear whoever. That is what makes it seem like a musical, coherent musical structure. Now, if I make these corrections, and take that away because I don't need it anymore, I see that I have a convenient metrical space to be working within. And in a sense, I've already started writing a setting of it by trying out some of these ideas. Now I come to a measure like this, and I go, well, hang on a second. Here 2 syllables, that's nice. There 2 syllables, that's nice. There I could see 2 syllables, that's nice. I can fill in those very quickly if I want. This might not be my final product, but it's at least a start. And what I'm doing is going for what we could call the low-hanging fruit. The measures where there are just 2 syllables, I'll give them 2 note values that add up to simple, duple, great. But I have these other measures where that's not the case, where I have 3 syllables. So things that I can do, of course, would include just playing around with the actual durational values I have in hand. Now, one thing I'll mention straight away, and that is typically when you are writing a syllabic setting for a singer, what you tend to do is write individual note values for each syllable. So you'll often see that in piano scores where they're accompanying a singer. You'll see even the same melodic line being notated in 2 completely different ways, where the singer with each of their syllables is being given these individualized note values. So you might see something like this, for example. Okay. For our purposes, what we'll do is write in a conventional instrumental fashion throughout, just to get comfortable with that, because that's what we've been using as the basis for understanding how rhythms work in the context of the beat and then also within the context of the measure. Okay? And that's going to be especially important when we come to compound meter settings later on. Okay, so I had a dog who was very nice. Her, now, love of caffeine. In this case, it seemed to make sense to give quite a bit more durational value in that measure to dog, because the idea of dog is the important thing here. That does give it a little bit more musical stress in some sense. I had a dog who was very nice. However, it isn't the case that you must have longer note values to give syllables their stress. Remember, we set up this entire setting in such a way that we are making certain that these stressed syllables are going to be arriving on metrically prominent beats. So we're not obliged to also make the notes long. That could be something that's supplied in an accompaniment, right? We're just thinking about the melodic line itself. And in that case, rather than love of caffeine, I kind of like the idea of having love of caffeine was her only vice. So I have a little bit of rhythmic variety in here. I had a dog who was very nice. Her love of caffeine was her only vice. Everything is where it needs to be. Everything is secure in that sense. And again, I start to feel like my musical imagination is freed up by this, because then I can start to notice things like, well, I started this line with a pickup, and that seemed to be a kind of signal. Oh, I have to remember that. That was the error from before when I had a note value that was too long, that was placing this on the downbeat. I've taken care of that. I'd like to have a similar thing happening for the second line. I had a dog. Why not have, over here, her love of caffeine was her only vice. Again, if I want to bring in a little bit more variety, I'm not too bothered by what's happening in the first line. I had a dog who was very nice. This is kind of boring me a little bit. Very sounds a little bit unmusical to my ears, like I'm not speaking as I normally would. I often say something is very nice, meaning the ver part is shorter than the re. So why not do the reverse of that here? Again, because this stressed syllable is on a downbeat, it's going to have a natural sense of stress or prominence being brought to it anyways. And sometimes, in fact, making that first note value shorter gives it a kind of emphasis, which I think you can hear. I had a dog who was very nice. Her love of caffeine was her only vice. I think this is a nice way to kind of pace things at the end, to sort of slow things down a little bit, to bring the whole song, as short as it is, to a conclusion. Now, there are other things, of course, that I can do. One thing that is nice to remember is we have these notation devices called tuplets that we were introduced to in the previous episode. There is a way in which I could apply that notational device here to pretend as though for a moment I have gone into another metrical framework for a moment. So remember, if we think of meter as a subdivision of one pulse by another, where we have a beat pulse subdividing a metrical pulse from downbeat to downbeat, that metrical pulse is something that can be subdivided itself in different ways. So in this case, the metrical pulse is a half note value. The beat structure is subdividing that into groups of two. Couldn't I at some point subdivide it into a group of three using a tuplet? So I've had a lot of emphasis of this simple duple meter up to this point. When I have three syllables here, couldn't I do something like the following? Imagining that I have my my downbeat pulse, the metrical pulse from there to there, occupying a half note value. Couldn't I do something like this? So making use of the tuplet to pretend as though for a moment I've gone into a 3/4 meter signature. So I'm not literally doing that. I'm not applying a change of meter, because that's something that in such a short song, and the way I'm doing things here would, I think, disrupt it a little bit too much. I still like the notion of a continuity in the metrical pulse, and that would be disrupted by actually changing meter there. So I'm using a tuplet to, in a sense, borrow division of that metrical pulse from another meter, just for a moment. So we call that borrow division. I'm using a tuplet to create a measure of borrow division from a simple triple meter. And here's what it sounds like. I had a dog who was very nice. Her love of caffeine was her only vice. So it fits in the flow very nicely, yes? Now, the other thing that I could do is compound this. So imagine this is like Chopin writing his funeral march, where it's unmistakable that there are these two-note units in the accompaniment. Or the John Williams version. Right? So the duple is unmistakably there, but you could still be asked to frame it as a 4/4 to compound things up. So what happens in that case here is, if I were to take out these intervening measures and actually turn that into a 4/4. So I'm hearing, what's compounding is the fact that I'm hearing underneath the structure submetrical units of 2, like I do in those marches I've just played, but they are themselves part of a larger group of 4. Okay? So in that case, what I've got now is stressed syllables that are still in precisely the right place. So that's why I've taught my initial approach to compound meter in that way. and start out text setting by working with a simple meter. You can take what were your simple metrical units and now make them submetrical units of a larger structure. And what's beautiful about it is all the syllables are already in the correct place. So I had a dog who was very nice. Her love of caffeine was her only vice. I made a little change there. I did that. And that's A-okay. Once again, this measure as a whole and that one together add up to 4/4. So we have complete measures that are there. But in characteristic 4/4, you have these two levels of beat prominence. You have the downbeat at the start of the unit and a subsidiary prominent beat in the middle. And you'll see that if someone is conducting a 4/4, they make ultimately the sign of a cross, and beats 1 and 3 are those metrically prominent beats. So the downbeat, 1, 2, and then the subsidiary prominent beat, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, like that, okay? So everything is already correctly placed. So this is why you must start your sketches as I showed you how, where you make certain that your stressed syllables are going to be associated with metrically prominent beats. Always start, at least when you're getting used to this, with a simple metrical setting of some type. Now, I happen to go in one particular direction here. I was working with simple duple, but clearly there's the possibility that I could go in another direction entirely. So let's go back to the sketch stage and see if we can take that in a completely different direction. Okay, so we're back to our original drawing board. Going to put that back in there. I can still see 4 stressed syllables per line. The stressed syllables are always positioned to be associated with downbeats, so that's helpful. And this time we want to build it up again, but in a different direction. Rather than working with units of duple meter, we want to work with simple triple. So, for example, if I were, I'll go with something like a 3/8. I can see 3 syllables here. I can put that in already. Of course, instrumentally writing, I could beam those things together, but I'm going to say that for a moment because I want to apply that notational device for a very particular reason later on. So 3 syllables there, 3 syllables there. I could put these things in place like that if I wanted to. Now, I have kind of the opposite problem that I had with the previous setting. I have the desire, I'm sure, for a nice pickup again, there and there. I like that idea before. I want to keep that in this setting. What that means then is that naturally, in a measure like this, I would have one syllable that was a little bit longer than the other one. So, of course, if I have only 2 syllables, it's no problem for me to adapt that to a simple triple setting, because I can just put in a quarter note there, and that gives me the idea for what I can do in these cases as well, where I have just 2 syllables. I'll just take it this far for now. I had a dog who was very nice, her, etc. Oh, I've got another 3 syllables there that I can put in. And there again. Now, of course, same idea for the incomplete measure. That plus that together must add up to that. If I want to have a little bit more variety in this, I had a dog who was very nice. In here, I'm starting to nod off a little bit. And once again, because this stressed syllable is already associated with a prominent beat, the downbeat, I can afford to do this kind of reversal of the note values, which, again, in a way, because it's shorter and on the downbeat, gives it a kind of emphasis of its own. This is a bit of metric variety I can use that will sound very nice. rhythmic variety, not metric variety. I had a dog who was very nice. Her love of caffeine was her only vice. I'd be tempted again to make the same switch there. Okay? All right, so here is a setting that goes in a completely different direction from the previous one. Note how they both started with the same framework and how easy it is for me to creatively take it in either of those directions and to come up with a perfectly feasible setting of it. Now, I would like to be able to do the same kind of thing that I did before, where I go, all right, this is fine. I had a dog who was very nice. Her love of caffeine was her only vice. I might find that a little too plodding in a way, that each of these stress syllables has the same amount of stress, the same amount of metrical prominence. Well, what I can do is differentiate between them by compounding. And of course, the simple thing for me to do is to take out every second bar line to create those larger units of 6 beats per measure, which means that this will now be a 6/8. And of course, when that happens, what I want to do is make sure that I can see what had been simple metrical units before now become submetrical units. So I will beam those where I can, like here, and of course here and here. And I have a visual picture of what I want this to feel like. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. In a 6/8, the metrically prominent beats are on 1 and 4, as we've seen before. Beat 1 has more prominence than beat 4, and so we have a sense of alternation between the two. I had a dog who was very nice. Her love of caffeine was her only vice. It fits together very well. I didn't have to change any of the rhythms to make sure that stress syllables were where they needed to be, because I started out my sketch with those bar lines being drawn precisely in front of the stress syllables. To start out with, all of the stress syllables are correctly located in a metrical framework. And then when I took out those intervening measures, they were still there, and everything sounds pretty good, I think. I get a little bit bored here. Love of caffeine was her only vice. So I'm thinking that I could just do something like this. I could even do something like that, just to change it up a little bit. I'm working within this metrical framework. You can see how easy it is for me to get rhythmically creative because everything is already in place. I had a dog who was very nice. Her love of caffeine was her only vice. So I start to have much more rhythmic interest, which was easy for me to introduce because with this clear framework in place, I could develop a sense of what might feel like nice rhythm. So that's an easy set of creative steps for me to take if I've set my foundation correctly. Now there is one thing that we have to watch out for, and that is the whole idea of compounding is one that I said, as long as you have your simple metrical setting correct, you just take out intervening measures and all the stress syllables are already associated with metrically prominent beats, everything is fine. There's one trap that we have to watch out for, and that is if we are dealing with creating lyrics and the lyrics themselves have a kind of structure that's implied. These are tetrameter lyrics. We have 4 stress syllables per line, and so we want to have a sense of where each line actually begins. Now, there is a way in which you could go for a compounding effect that would mess that up. Specifically, if I said, well, the only thing that matters is the fact that I have stress syllables at the start of at least each of the submetrical units, so like there, there, and there, and there. I could do something like this, right? And so this will become the start of another measure. And what I'm doing is building up a 9/8. All right, let's see what that will look like. and I'll assume that this continues on down here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and away I go. And then I'll have to have a lot of rests at the end to make up for that. Okay, so if I were to go with this idea, it would sound like the following. I had a duck who was very nice, her love. Was it. The problem is that I'm suddenly giving a downbeat onto a syllable that's at the end of a line. And so I'm not able to hear the start of the next line in the correct place. The use of a 9/8 is going against the structure of the tetrameter, because a 9/8 is implying groups of 3, so that's kind of cutting things in the wrong location. I want to retain the idea of 4 stressed syllables per line. What I could do, if I wanted to, was actually go for something like a 12/8. In which case I've got 1 measure per line. But this is something that would sound correct. It's something that we can refer to as a compound quadruple. It's often described in that fashion because if a 6/8 could be heard as a compound duple, meaning that I have something that's being subdivided by the submetrical units into 2, and then of course each of these by the beat pulse into groups of 3, like so. I can have this compound quadruple idea where something is being subdivided into 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So I've gone from simple 3/8 through a compounding effect that would still work a 6/8, and now to the next one that would work a 12/8. And by the way, the basic conducting framework for a 12/8 follows the quadruple beat pattern 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So you have that sense of 1, 2, 3, 4. And then you can actually make little gestures within each of those main strokes to indicate 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, like that. But it's coming out of that cross pattern again, okay? So 3/8, fine. Maybe I want to have some differentiation between the stressed syllables so it's not too plodding. I can pop up to 6/8. I can go even further up to 12/8. 9/8 will not work because that is going to be going against the grain of the text itself. The text has 4 stressed syllables per line. A 9/8 means that you're going to be ending up giving a downbeat to something that's at the end of a line, and that's going to throw the structure of the text off. We say it throws off the scansion, okay? Now there's another possibility that we could consider, and that is to say, look, I've explored the possibilities for simple duple and then expanded that to quadruple. I explored the possibilities for simple triple and then expanded that into compound 6/8 and 12/8. Also, of course, the misstep of the 9/8. So I've gone in either of these directions. Simple duple as either the main metrical unit or the submetrical unit, and simple triple either as the main metrical unit or, again, a submetrical unit. Can I possibly bring these things together? Because that was one of the possibilities we learned about earlier on in this episode, right? The idea of these asymmetric meters. Why couldn't we, in a sense, mix and match these in some way? So let's explore that next. Once again, I'll wipe down the board and we'll start from precisely the same framework that we've used in every case, but this time we're going to look for a little bit new option. Okay, so what I've done is go right back to square one, where I'm imagining working with a simple meter. Ultimately, I can't do that if I want to create an asymmetric meter, because remember, an asymmetric meter is made of different types of submetrical units. So the compound meters, it's the same types, 3 plus 3 or 2 plus 2. If we're working with an asymmetric meter, it has to be a 3 plus a 2. So to help me actually see that, what I want to do first is look at what these individual metrical units might be like. So once again, I have a sense of how I could go just based on the syllable count that I have per measure. I see 2 syllables there and 3 syllables there. Let's imagine that I was going to work with something that was going to have an 8th note pulse, meaning that I'll be able to apply beaming to clearly see the submetrical units that will result. So if I was going with an 8th note pulse, I could have 2 8ths here and 3 8ths there. Let's say I started with an 8th pickup once again. I had a dog who was now I only have 2 syllables there, but I'm looking for the possibility of combining different types of submetrical unit, 2 plus 3 as it's turning out, 2 plus 3. I can come up with a 3 unit here, no problem. So what I'm suggesting is that in fact what I could come up with is a 5/8. I'll bring these groupings of 2s and 3s together, and I can see that result in this fashion with my beaming. And the result is something that makes good metrical sense, because once again, this isn't just a way of drawing things. I'm actually feeling these different submetrical units jostling with each other. I had a dog who was very nice. Her love of, now here this will get a little bit more interesting. I'm not obliged in an asymmetric meter to always stay with the same sequence of the groups, 2 plus 3, 2 plus 3. It will go back and forth. This is the case in that movement, the slow movement of the Chopin First Piano Sonata. However, just for the sake of trying this idea out, I will go for consistency here, which means that I want this to be that grouping of 3, meaning that here I need to pack this into 2 beats. And so I'd say simplest thing to do would be something like that. Love of caffeine was her only. And then vice, we had an incomplete measure there. We need 4 8ths over there. And I have an asymmetric meter that is making consistent, intelligent use of submetrical units of 2 and 3. I had a dog who was very nice. Her love of caffeine was her only vice. So it kind of hops back and forth a little bit on a regular basis, and it creates a nice musical effect. So this is the kind of thing that you can do very quickly and easily if you start out with that basic framework. So for a course like this, it's really important at this stage to give yourself the opportunity to build from a secure foundation. Believe me, I can tell when students don't do that. It is immediately obvious. So that's why I've taken the trouble to show you these steps. Right now, it might seem a bit formulaic to do so, but I hope you've seen, as I've gone through the process, how much creativity it makes possible in the ultimate rhythmic values I'm going to be working with. It's kind of easier for me to see those possibilities when I have a secure framework in place. Now, right now, it might seem mechanical to kind of do it in these stages. Over time, and it can happen very quickly, your mind will actually create those stages for you. You won't even notice it as you're writing songs. Right away, your brain will be saying, okay, here's this text, and just have a sense of how to proceed with it. So all we're doing is articulating that process for ourselves right now, and notice how many different settings we've been able to come up with in very short order by establishing this basic kind of foundation. So I hope you'll find this a very useful way to do these kinds of things, because I still remember when I was first teaching this course many years ago, And once I thought it was a clever idea to ask students on a midterm to notate just the rhythms for Happy Birthday. And I was quite shocked by how many students couldn't hope to do so. And I realized that I was missing out something very fundamental in the way in which I taught the use of meter and rhythm and how they fit together. And I thought what I really need to do is teach an introduction to songwriting at this level. So if you use this process, guaranteed you will be able to notate either the well-attested version of Happy Birthday, the one that everyone knows. You could come up with alternative versions for it, as we've seen here, but whatever you'd be coming up with would be metrically sound and the text setting would be correct. So that's a tremendous skill to be able to call upon, and that's why I hope you'll find this kind of layering approach to be a particularly useful and efficient approach. A segment from a Prokofiev etude, and for a very particular reason. We've been introduced to certain kinds of tools of metric analysis and applications of meter in this episode using some very conventional structures. What I want to see is what happens if we combine them in unusual ways, things that aren't part of the normal basic introduction to the use of meter. Now, this is a piece of music that Prokofiev wrote when he was, I think, about 17 years old. It's from the first of his 4 etudes, Opus 2, which are absolutely wonderful pieces, absolutely full of genius. If you ever want to hear a stunning performance of one of them, check out Yevgeny Kissin playing the third Prokofiev etude. It's from a live Carnegie Hall performance. It's absolutely spellbinding. Anyhow, what's happening here is Prokofiev is combining two very different components in his musical texture, and in fact, two very different kinds of meters. So on the one hand, we talked about how you can have compound meters where you can have different layers of metrical activity that all nonetheless fit together in a particular coherent fashion. We also had the idea of asymmetric meters where you use different types of set metrical units, kind of linking them together like, I'd say, cars on a train, and the whole musical structure moves along, hopping from one train car to the next. We also considered the idea of changing meter. We introduced the idea of the hemiola, where we're kind of going back and forth between different meters. The one thing we haven't considered is the possibility that you could have different levels of metrical activity happening at exactly the same time. So if I listen to what the left hand is doing, I have a whole series of, those are 16th notes, and it sounds like a subdivision of a beat of some kind. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Okay? The right hand is doing something else. It has this melody. So if I put those things together, they make a rather odd combination. What I'd like us to do is see how Prokofiev is actually putting together two completely different metrical structures, which do fit together in a certain way, but play against each other. And then you'll be quite surprised, I think, what time signature he gives to this. So I'll just move us to the board. So I've written just one measure of the Prokofiev etude on the board behind me. And if we look at its different parts individually, we'd have no problems understanding it. If I look at this measure, I can see something that would quickly suggest a 6/8 because I've clearly got 6 eighth note beats, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I have the characteristic beaming into submetrical units of simple triple on either side. Note how you can put a rest in the middle of that, even if there isn't another note there to be connected to the beam. You can retain that submetrical unit beaming over top of it, kind of a roof for the unit, because that really is showing how the composer intends it to be played. I'm feeling it as a compound meter, these two triplet groupings, one after the other. So I'd have no problems putting that in front. If I look at the bass, however, I see a pattern that would correspond with a 3/4 time signature. These are 16th notes. The pattern is repeating itself, so all I've done underneath is summarize that fact. And again, I would say, all right, viewing that by itself, it clearly is using a 3/4 time signature. Now you might remember from earlier in this episode when we also had a combination of 6/8 and 3/4. That was in the context of West Side Story, the song America. The composer for that is Leonard Bernstein. And what Bernstein was doing was hopping back and forth between a sort of framing 6/8 and jumping into the 3/4. So it's kind of like what Bernstein was doing was going 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 1 2. Okay? But what's different here, of course, is that Prokofiev is doing these things simultaneously. We have a 6/8 and a 3/4 at the same time. So what did Prokofiev actually write for his meter signature? You guessed it. C for common time. So obviously we could treat this as a sort of joke on Prokofiev's part because nothing adds up in any measure to 4/4, and that is what C for common time should represent. However, it could also be the case that Prokofiev, as a young genius, like I said, I think it was maybe age 17 when he wrote this, was thinking in metrical terms for which there were no received categories. So there had to be some way in which he could write music that would satisfy his inspiration, but he nonetheless came up the limits of what time signatures could do. So in a sense, this is both a joke and Prokofiev saying, you know, what I'm writing has its own consistency, its own internal logic. That is what matters, rather than working with some information that I might have gotten out of one of my theory courses. So I think that's a very important point for us to take away from this. Hopefully what we're working with are tools that can be useful to us. I mean, I think it was helpful for us to know about 6/8 and 3/4 to understand how Prokofiev is syncing these different parts together. But at the same time, we don't want those tools to be the limit of our musical horizons. Maybe there can be other kinds of music out there that can open us up to new possibilities for the organization of meter, and that our tools enable us to grasp hold of some of those new ideas rather than saying, well, they're just not possible. So the last thing that I want to do is actually play a little excerpt of some Indian classical music. And the reason why I want to do that is because there's a way in which we can use some of our training in meter to understand musical tradition that's not officially described by any of the terminology or concepts we've been working with. And what I would like to do is listen to a little bit of a rhythm played by Zakir Hussain on tabla. And the idea there is that rather than playing with another instrument, the tabla is a percussion instrument. It's one where you can actually rapidly change the tension on the drum skin surface. So you can actually generate all sorts of patterns through the use of pitch. So remember, once again, as we were emphasizing at the start of this episode, rhythm, meter, all of that stuff does not stand independently of pitch and may in fact rely to a great extent on the framework supplied by pitch. So we'll hear just a little bit of Hussain playing his tabla, but to start out with, he is going to be counting a rhythmic cycle. He's going to be counting up to 10, and he's going to be providing slightly different emphases in his counting on certain numbers. So let's take a listen to that.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 2, 4, 6, 7, 8, 9.
Okay, so obviously I would just love to leave that track playing. I can't think of any more fantastic rhythmic tradition than what you can hear in Indian classical music. And ordinarily, this would be paired with someone playing a sitar, for example, in the context of a raga. By the way, we'll listen to a little bit of a raga in a future episode. I'll put it at the end of episode 7, where we try to understand what kind of musical sounds they're working with. But the tabla player here is starting out by letting us know what rhythmic framework he is working with. As I mentioned before, he's counting from 1 to 10, and he's emphasizing it in a particular way. So if I were to represent that idea, the simplest thing for me to do is to just write out the numbers. And see if I can remember how he was emphasizing them. What these represent are beats in our sense. So as he was counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, those are going to form a beat structure for the percussion improvisation that he's going to be doing. However, he's not doing it, as I just said, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, which would create a whole series of two-note units, two-note submetrical units, all the same kind of thing. It's much more interesting than that. Let's listen to just that opening count once more.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
So what I'm hearing is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So we have a larger cycle of 10 beats that's being subdivided into units that might seem familiar to us. 2 plus 3 plus 2 plus 3. So here is some kind of compound metrical system, but it's working with different types of submetrical units. So for our purposes, this would be yet again an example of a kind of asymmetric meter. And in fact, I also get a sense of a little bit of a softening of that beat in his count, as though it were actually 2 plus 5 plus 3, and then the 5 has a subdivision within it of 3 plus 2. So that becomes the metrical framework for all of the fantastic rhythmic improvisation that takes place on top of that. So once again, it comes back to a point that we were making in the previous episode, which is that we don't just hear rhythm as a series of durations by themselves. There's some kind of framework that they imply, and that enriches our experience of the rhythms themselves. Now, what's astonishing about this, of course, is that we have someone who is creating all of his rhythmic improvisation while at the same time insisting that it fit within this underlying structure. To be able to do that mentally is absolutely extraordinary, and to be able to do that physically at the same time, you probably were listening to some of the notes that he was playing with his fingers and palms of his hands and just astonished at how he could produce that. I still don't know how it's possible, although I've seen it live. So here's a way in which I hope that some of the ideas that we've learned in this episode can help us appreciate phenomenal music out there that I haven't directly taught about, and I hope that it will get you very interested in the possibilities for meter in music from all over the world.